August 6, 1945. 8:14 a.m. Hiroshima, Japan. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, director of the Hiroshima Communications Hospital, stood at his window watching the morning sky, grateful for the clear weather after days of oppressive humidity. A single American B-29 bomber flew overhead at tremendous altitude, trailing white contrails across the blue expanse. The air raid sirens had sounded briefly at 7:09 a.m. when 3 B-29s appeared, then fell silent when the planes departed. Now this lone aircraft circled lazily, seemingly conducting reconnaissance. Hachiya noted the time on his pocket watch and turned back toward his desk, already composing his thoughts for the morning staff meeting scheduled for 8:30. He never reached his desk. At 8:15 a.m. and 17 seconds, the world ended and began again in the same instant. A light brighter than 1,000 suns erupted 1,900 feet above the Shima Surgical Clinic in downtown Hiroshima. In the first microsecond, the temperature at ground zero reached 5,400 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to vaporize stone. The blast wave expanded at 984 feet per second, faster than sound itself. Everything within 1,000 yards of the hypocenter simply ceased to exist. People, buildings, trees, vehicles, animals, every physical object was converted to superheated gas and scattered atoms in a fraction of a second, too brief for human comprehension. Dr. Hachiya's window exploded inward, shredding his body with thousands of glass fragments as the building collapsed around him. He would survive, barely, to write one of the most detailed accounts of nuclear warfare's debut. His diary entry for that morning, written days later from memory because the original had been destroyed, began with words that captured absolute incomprehension. This was not war. This was not any weapon I had ever read about or imagined. This was something outside human experience, something that belonged to nightmares or mythology, not to a Monday morning in August. 70,000 to 80,000 people died instantly in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. By the end of 1945, the death toll would reach approximately 140,000, as radiation sickness, burns, and injuries killed thousands more daily. The weapon that accomplished this had been carried in the bomb bay of a single aircraft, released by a crew who never saw the faces of their victims, and detonated with such efficiency that only 1.5% of its uranium-235 actually fissioned, meaning that 98.5% of the world's first combat atomic weapon had been wasted, and the explosion was still powerful enough to destroy an entire city. The mathematics of nuclear warfare were being written not in military doctrine or strategic theory, but in the shadows of human bodies permanently burned into stone sidewalks, in the flash burns that marked the pattern of clothing on skin, in the ruins of a city where 67% of all structures within 5,000 meters of the hypocenter were destroyed or rendered unusable, and in the radiation that would continue killing for decades after the explosion itself had faded into history. The weapon that should not exist. The roots of Hiroshima's destruction lay 3 years earlier in a converted squash court beneath the University of Chicago's Stagg Field, where humanity first achieved controlled nuclear fission on December 2, 1942. Enrico Fermi, an Italian physicist who had fled fascism and won the Nobel Prize for his work on radioactivity, supervised the construction of Chicago Pile 1, the world's first nuclear reactor. The device was primitive, a carefully stacked arrangement of uranium oxide and purified graphite blocks forming a roughly spherical shape 25 feet wide. Control rods made of cadmium-coated wood could be inserted or withdrawn to regulate the neutron flux and control the chain reaction. On that December afternoon, Fermi ordered the control rods withdrawn incrementally while instruments measured neutron activity. At 3:25 p.m., the neutron count began rising exponentially, indicating that a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction had been achieved. Fermi allowed the reaction to continue for 28 minutes, generating approximately 0.5 watts of power, enough to prove the concept but nowhere near enough for practical application. He then ordered the control rods reinserted, shutting down the reaction. The significance was absolute. Humanity had learned to release the energy-binding atomic nuclei, energy that Einstein's equation, E=mc2, had proven existed in amounts so vast that a single kilogram of matter, if completely converted to energy, would release the equivalent of 21.5 megatons of TNT. The uranium atoms in Fermi's pile were not being completely converted, merely split. But even that partial conversion released millions of times more energy per atom than chemical explosives. Physicist Eugene Wigner, who had worked on the theoretical calculations predicting the chain reaction, brought a bottle of Chianti to the squash court to celebrate. The scientists passed the bottle around, each taking a sip in silence. Years later, Wigner recalled the moment's duality. We knew we had achieved something magnificent in pure scientific terms. We also knew, every one of us knew, that we had just opened a door that could never be closed. The power to destroy cities, perhaps to end civilization, was now theoretically possible. Whether it would become practically possible depended on engineering, industrial capacity, and most terrifyingly, political will. The Manhattan Project. The program that would transform theoretical possibility into apocalyptic reality began officially in September 1942, though preliminary research had started years earlier. Major General Leslie Groves, a career Army engineer who had just completed supervising construction of the Pentagon, received orders to take command of the Manhattan Engineer District, a deliberately vague name designed to disguise the project's true purpose. Groves was 46 years old, overweight, abrasive, and possessed of an organizational genius that would prove essential. His first action was to promote himself to brigadier general, ensuring he had sufficient rank to commandeer resources without explanation. Groves immediately grasped the project's staggering requirements. Building an atomic bomb required solving problems that had never been addressed in human history. Natural uranium contained only 0.7% of the fissionable isotope U-235, with the remainder being non-fissionable U-238. Creating a bomb required concentrating U-235 to 80% or higher purity, a process that required separating atoms that differed in mass by only 1.3%. No chemical process could accomplish this. Physical separation methods would need to be invented, tested, and scaled to industrial size. Alternatively, scientists could create plutonium-239, an entirely synthetic element that didn't exist in nature, by bombarding U-238 with neutrons in a nuclear reactor. This plutonium would be inherently fissionable, but would need to be chemically separated from intensely radioactive uranium in quantities sufficient to build weapons. The chemistry would need to be performed by remote manipulation because direct exposure to the radiation would be instantly fatal. Groves assembled a team of America's most brilliant scientists and gave them unlimited resources. The project would eventually employ 130,000 people at dozens of secret facilities across the United States, consuming $2 billion in 1945 dollars, equivalent to approximately $28 billion in 2020 currency. Security was absolute. Workers at uranium enrichment facilities in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, performed their tasks without knowing what they were producing. Only a few dozen people knew the project's ultimate goal. Groves selected J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist from the University of California, Berkeley, to direct the weapons laboratory. This choice baffled many. Oppenheimer had never managed a large project, had questionable political associations that would have normally disqualified him from security clearance, and was physically frail. But Oppenheimer possessed a unique combination of theoretical brilliance, ability to understand and coordinate specialists across disciplines, and most critically, the capacity to make decisions under pressure when no perfect solution existed. The laboratory was established at Los Alamos, New Mexico, on a remote mesa 7,300 feet above sea level, accessible only by a single dirt road. Here, some of the world's greatest scientific minds worked under conditions of absolute secrecy to transform nuclear physics from theory to weapon. The technical challenge. Creating an atomic bomb required solving two fundamental problems: obtaining sufficient fissionable material and designing a mechanism to detonate it with maximum efficiency. The uranium enrichment program consumed vast resources for uncertain results. The electromagnetic separation process, developed at Oak Ridge, used massive calutrons devices that ionized uranium atoms and used magnetic fields to separate the slightly lighter U-235 from heavier U-238. Each calutron required copper wiring equivalent to thousands of miles, but copper was desperately needed for war production. Groves obtained a loan of 1,400 tons of silver from the United States Treasury, worth $300 million, and had it drawn into wire for the calutron magnets. This silver would be returned after the war, not a single ounce missing. The gaseous diffusion process pumped uranium hexafluoride gas through thousands of barriers with microscopically small holes. The lighter U-235 molecules diffused through the barriers slightly faster than U-238, allowing gradual enrichment through thousands of stages. The process required barriers that would resist corrosion from the intensely reactive uranium hexafluoride, while containing holes approximately 0.001 millimeters in diameter. Manufacturing these barriers in industrial quantities pushed American metallurgy to its limits. After 3 years of development, the Oak Ridge facilities were producing approximately 50 kilograms of weapons-grade U-235 annually, barely sufficient for a single bomb. The plutonium program offered better prospects for mass production. Nuclear reactors at Hanford, Washington, bombarded uranium with neutrons, converting U-238 to plutonium-239. The reactors operated continuously, producing plutonium at rates that could eventually sustain regular weapon production. But plutonium presented a different detonation challenge. The gun-type design planned for uranium, where one piece of U-235 would be fired into another to achieve critical mass, would not work with plutonium. The spontaneous neutron emission rate was too high. A gun-type plutonium weapon would pre-detonate, producing a fissile yield of perhaps a few tons of TNT equivalent rather than the desired kilotons. Los Alamos scientists, led by Seth Neddermeyer and later refined by John von Neumann, developed the implosion concept. A sphere of plutonium, subcritical by itself, would be surrounded by specially shaped conventional explosives. When detonated simultaneously at multiple points, the explosives would create a convergent shock wave that compressed the plutonium to supercritical density in microseconds faster than pre-detonation could occur. Getting this to work required solving problems in high-explosive physics, hydrodynamics, and precision timing that pushed the boundaries of 1940s technology. The Trinity Test, July 16, 1945. 5:29:45 a.m., Alamogordo Bombing Range, New Mexico. The world's first nuclear device sat atop a 100-foot steel tower in the desert, a grotesque sphere of conventional explosives surrounding a plutonium core no larger than a baseball. The bomb had been assembled over the previous 48 hours by scientists whose hands literally held the fate of the Manhattan Project. If the device failed to detonate or produced only a fizzle, 3 years of work and $2 billion would be wasted. If it succeeded, humanity would possess a weapon that could destroy cities. Oppenheimer waited in a bunker 10,000 yards from ground zero, chain-smoking and muttering fragments of Hindu scripture he had read years earlier. His deputy, Kenneth Bainbridge, who had supervised the test preparations, sat beside him watching instrument panels that would measure the explosion's yield. The countdown reached zero at 5:29:45 a.m. For a fraction of a second, nothing visible occurred. Then light erupted from the tower, light so intense that observers 10 miles away instinctively flinched despite welding goggles and being instructed to look away. The fireball expanded to 600 feet in diameter in less than a second, with surface temperature exceeding 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The steel tower vaporized instantly. The shock wave reached the observation bunkers 40 seconds later, rattling equipment and shaking the ground. Bainbridge turned to Oppenheimer and spoke words that captured the moment's duality. "Now we are all sons of bitches." Oppenheimer himself recalled a different quotation from the Bhagavad Gita, spoken by the god Vishnu. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The explosion yield was estimated at 22 kilotons of TNT equivalent, exceeding most predictions. The test had been an unqualified success. The plutonium implosion design worked. America possessed a weapon that could destroy any city on Earth with a single bomb carried by a single aircraft. That same morning, halfway around the world, Japanese workers were beginning their Monday shifts in factories, hospitals, and government offices across Hiroshima, unaware that their lives had just been rendered contingent on decisions being made in Washington by men they would never meet. The political calculus, the decision to use atomic weapons against Japan, was made in a context of total war, where civilian casualties had long since ceased to shock military planners. By mid-1945, American firebombing raids had already killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. The March 9–10, 1945 raid on Tokyo killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night as incendiary bombs created a firestorm consuming 16 square miles. Similar raids had devastated every major Japanese city. The alternative to bombing was invasion. Operation Downfall, scheduled to begin November 1, 1945, would invade Kyushu, followed by Honshu in March 1946. American planners estimated casualties ranging from 200,000 to over 1 million American personnel, with Japanese casualties potentially in the millions. Okinawa's fighting, April through June 1945, killed 12,500 Americans and 110,000 Japanese soldiers, with over 100,000 civilian casualties. Extrapolating this to Home Island's invasion suggested catastrophic losses. President Harry Truman faced a decision no president had confronted: whether to use weapons that could instantly destroy cities to force surrender without invasion. The arguments in favor were coldly logical. Kill 100,000 or to 300,000 now to save potentially millions later. The arguments against were moral. Atomic weapons represented qualitative change, setting a precedent that could never be reversed. Truman decided in July 1945 at Potsdam the atomic bomb would be used against Japanese cities without warning to achieve maximum psychological impact. The order was issued July 25, 1945. The selection of Hiroshima, the target committee, consisting of military officers and Manhattan Project scientists, evaluated potential Japanese cities using criteria that revealed the cold calculation behind the decision. The ideal target would be a city that had not been significantly damaged by previous bombing raids, allowing clear assessment of atomic weapon effects. It should contain military facilities, war industries, or troop concentrations to provide military justification for attack. It should be large enough that the weapon's destructive radius would destroy a significant portion of the city. And it should have terrain features that would maximize blast and heat effects, such as being located in a valley where hills would reflect the shock wave back onto the city. 4 cities were placed on the target list: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki. Kyoto, Japan's ancient capital with over 1 million inhabitants, was initially considered but removed from the list by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who appreciated its cultural significance and believed destroying it would embitter Japanese people against America for generations. Hiroshima met every criterion perfectly. It was a city of approximately 350,000 people that had been deliberately spared from conventional bombing raids. It was a major military logistics hub, containing the headquarters of the Japanese Second Army and serving as a staging area for forces defending southern Japan. The city sat on the Otter River Delta, with hills surrounding the central area on 3 sides, perfect for concentrating blast effects. And it had military-industrial facilities, including Mitsubishi Heavy Industries plants and the Hiroshima Army Ordnance Supply Depot. American planners drew an aiming point at the center of the city, at the T-shaped Aioi Bridge that was easily identifiable from high altitude. The weapon would detonate at approximately 1,900 feet altitude to maximize blast and heat effects rather than cratering. At this height, the fireball would not touch the ground, minimizing radioactive fallout but maximizing the radius of destruction from blast and thermal radiation. Colonel Paul Tibbets, commanding the 509th Composite Group, selected his most experienced crew for the mission. The aircraft, a B-29 Superfortress, was named Enola Gay after Tibbets's mother. The bomb, designated Little Boy, contained approximately 140 pounds of uranium-235 in a gun-type design that was so reliable it had never been tested. The scientists were confident it would work. The crew was not told exactly what they were carrying, only that it was a single bomb with destructive power equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. The mission, August 5, 1945, evening, Tinian Island. Tibbets briefed his crew and revealed, for the first time to most of them, that they would be dropping an atomic bomb. The silence in the briefing room was absolute. Some crew members had speculated about the unusual secrecy surrounding their training and the modifications made to their aircraft. Now they understood. They would be delivering a weapon that could destroy an entire city. Captain Robert Lewis, Enola Gay's co-pilot, asked the question others were thinking. "Sir, will we know if it works immediately?" Tibbets responded, "You'll know. Everyone for 100 miles will know." The crew attended religious services offered by 2 chaplains assigned to the 509th. Some prayed. Others simply sat in silence, processing what they were about to do. Major Thomas Ferriby, the bombardier who would actually release the weapon, wrote a letter to his parents that he sealed with instructions it only be opened if he did not return. The letter's contents were never revealed, but Ferriby told friends years later that he had tried to explain why he believed the mission was necessary, even knowing what it would do. Enola Gay lifted off at 2:45 a.m. on August 6th. The aircraft was heavily loaded with fuel for the 2,800-mile round trip to Hiroshima and back, and with the 9,700-pound Little Boy bomb. 2 other B-29s accompanied as observation and photography aircraft. The flight north was uneventful. At 7:09 a.m., 3 B-29s made a weather reconnaissance run over Hiroshima, triggering air raid sirens, then departed. The all-clear sounded at 7:31 a.m. Residents emerged from shelters and resumed their morning routines. Enola Gay approached Hiroshima at 31,000 feet altitude. Visibility was perfect, with only scattered clouds. Ferriby had clear line of sight to the Aioi Bridge aiming point. At 8:15 a.m. and 17 seconds, he toggled the bomb release. Little Boy fell for 43 seconds, dropping from 31,000 feet to the predetermined detonation altitude of 1,900 feet. During those 43 seconds, Enola Gay executed a sharp diving turn to gain distance from the coming explosion. The crew had been instructed to wear special welding goggles to protect their eyes from the flash. Lewis pulled out a camera to photograph the event. Little Boy detonated at 8:16 a.m. and 2 seconds, directly above Dr. Kanji Maida's clinic on Saikumachi Street, approximately 800 feet southeast of the intended Aioi Bridge aiming point. The deviation of 800 feet from the aiming point was caused by slight wind drift during the 43-second fall. This minor targeting error was strategically irrelevant. The weapon's destructive radius was so vast that everything within a mile of the aiming point would be obliterated regardless. The physical effects. The atomic explosion released energy through multiple mechanisms that killed through different physical processes depending on distance from the hypocenter. The initial nuclear reaction occurred in approximately 1 microsecond, splitting enough uranium atoms to release energy equivalent to 15 kilotons of TNT. This energy emerged as thermal radiation, blast wave, and prompt nuclear radiation traveling outward at different speeds. The thermal pulse arrived first, traveling at the speed of light. Within a radius of 1,000 yards from the hypocenter, thermal radiation was sufficient to vaporize exposed human flesh. People outdoors simply disappeared, their bodies converted to superheated gas. In many cases, their shadows were burned into stone or concrete surfaces, permanent marks where their bodies had briefly shielded material from the thermal radiation before being vaporized. Out to approximately 2 miles, the thermal pulse ignited flammable materials instantly. Wood burst into flame without transitional stages of smoking or smoldering. Clothing ignited on people's bodies. Exposed skin suffered third-degree burns extending through all layers of tissue. The pattern of clothing often marked burn severity, with dark-colored garments absorbing more heat and producing deeper burns, while white clothing reflected thermal radiation and provided slight protection. Many survivors bore burn patterns matching the designs on their clothing. The blast wave arrived milliseconds after the thermal pulse, traveling initially faster than sound but slowing as distance increased. At ground zero, the overpressure exceeded 20 pounds per square inch, enough to pulverize concrete and collapse the strongest buildings. The wind behind the shock front reached 980 miles per hour, exceeding any natural tornado. These forces simply erased structures within 1,000 yards of the hypocenter. Buildings didn't collapse so much as disintegrate, their materials scattered as debris across hundreds of yards. Between 1,000 yards and 1 mile, overpressure exceeded 5 psi, sufficient to collapse most wooden structures and heavily damage masonry buildings. People indoors were crushed by collapsing roofs and walls, or killed by flying debris traveling at hundreds of miles per hour. Windows exploded inward, shredding anyone standing near them with glass fragments traveling faster than bullets. The blast wave was followed milliseconds later by powerful winds as air rushed back toward the low-pressure zone created by the explosion, then rushed outward again as pressure equalized. These reversing winds tossed survivors through the air, slammed them into debris, and created firestorms as fires ignited by the thermal pulse were fanned by hurricane-force winds. Prompt nuclear radiation, primarily gamma rays and neutrons, killed through different mechanisms. People within 1,000 yards who somehow survived the thermal pulse and blast wave received lethal doses of radiation, exceeding 1,000 rems. They would die within days from acute radiation syndrome as their bone marrow ceased producing blood cells and their intestinal lining sloughed away. Between 1,000 yards and 1 mile, radiation doses remained high enough to cause severe radiation sickness in most survivors. The human experience. First-hand accounts from Hiroshima survivors describe experiences that challenged the limits of human comprehension. Michihiko Hachaya, the hospital director who survived the initial blast, wrote in his diary about the immediate aftermath. I climbed to my feet somehow, bleeding from dozens of glass cuts, and looked out where my window had been. The city was gone. Where buildings had stood moments before, I saw only rubble and flames. People were staggering through the streets, many of them naked because the thermal flash had burned their clothing off. Their skin hung in sheets from their arms and faces. They held their arms out in front of them, bent at the elbows, because the burned skin was so painful they could not let their arms touch their bodies. They walked like ghosts, silent, staring, without purpose or destination. Many simply collapsed and died in the streets. I did not understand what had happened. I knew it was not a conventional bomb. No bomb could do this to an entire city in a single instant. Akiko Takakura, a 20-year-old bank clerk who was 980 feet from the hypo center, provided one of the closest survivor accounts. I was standing at my desk when the room filled with light, brighter than anything I'd ever seen, bright enough that I could see my own bones through my hands as I raised them to shield my face. Then came the impact, throwing me across the room. The building collapsed. I was buried under rubble, but somehow was not crushed. When I finally freed myself and reached the street, I saw that I was essentially the only person moving. Everyone around me was dead or dying. My own injuries were severe burns covering my face and arms, but I could walk. I wandered through the ruins, seeing visions from hell. Bodies burned beyond recognition, people with their intestines hanging out, begging for water. Children crying beside the corpses of their parents. The heat from fires was so intense I could feel my skin blistering from yards away. I don't remember most of that first day. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. Yoshitaka Kawamoto, 13 years old, was mobilized with his school class to create fire breaks by demolishing buildings. His class was working 200 yards from the hypo center when the bomb detonated. The flash was so bright I thought the sun had fallen from the sky and exploded on the ground. The blast threw me through the air. When I regained consciousness, I was burning. My clothes were on fire. I rolled on the ground to extinguish the flames. Around me were my classmates, most of them dead. Some were still alive but burned so severely I could not recognize who they were. One boy was calling for his mother, but he had no face. Just raw, burned flesh where his features had been. I tried to help him, but there was nothing I could do. He died while I held him. I still hear his voice sometimes, calling for his mother. I never knew who he was. His face had been burned off. Dr. Shuntaro Haida, a physician who was outside the city treating a patient when the bomb exploded, returned to find his hospital destroyed and most of his colleagues dead. I arrived at the hospital around 10 a.m. The building no longer existed. In its place was rubble and flames. I found patients and staff wandering in the ruins, many with injuries I'd never seen in medical training. Burns covering 80%, 90% of the body surface. Massive trauma from blast effects. But most disturbing were the patients who appeared relatively uninjured but were vomiting, losing their hair, bleeding from their gums and rectum. I did not understand what was causing these symptoms. We had no word for radiation sickness. These patients died within days, despite all we tried. We were helpless. The hospital had been destroyed. We had almost no medical supplies. We treated patients outdoors, under the sun, in the ruins. Most died. I estimated that my survival rate was perhaps 10% of the patients I treated in the first week. The other 90% died. Many begged me to kill them because their pain was so severe. I could not. I could only watch them die. Reverend Kiyoshi Tanimoto, a Methodist pastor, described his attempts to help survivors. I spent the day after the bomb pulling people from rivers where they had jumped seeking relief from their burns. Most had drowned or died from their injuries before I reached them. The Ota River was full of corpses, hundreds of them floating downstream toward the sea. The survivors I was able to help, there was so little I could do. I had no medical training. I had no supplies. I could only offer water, shelter, and comfort. Many died while I prayed with them. I performed last rites for Buddhists, Christians, people of no faith, anyone who needed spiritual comfort in their final moments. I stopped counting after the first 100. There were too many. By the second day, I was numb. I moved through the ruins mechanically, doing what I could, but feeling nothing. The scale of death was too vast for human emotional response. Emiko Okada was 7 years old, walking to school approximately 1 mile from the hypo center. I remember the flash, then nothing. When I woke up, my mother was carrying me. My back was badly burned. My mother later told me that the thermal radiation had burned away my clothing and skin on my back. She was carrying me to find medical help, but there was no medical help. The hospitals were destroyed. The doctors were dead. We lived in a makeshift shelter for weeks. My burns became infected. I developed a high fever. My mother thought I would die, but I survived. My back healed, but the scars remain. For years, I could not look at my own back in a mirror. The scars were too terrible. Now I'm old and my back is one large scar, a permanent reminder of August 6, 1945. The immediate aftermath: in the hours and days following the detonation, Hiroshima descended into a hell that overwhelmed all attempts at organized response. The city's medical infrastructure was destroyed in the initial blast. Of 298 doctors in Hiroshima, approximately 270 were killed or too severely injured to work. Of 1,180 nurses, 1,650 were casualties. The Red Cross Hospital, the city's largest medical facility, lost most of its staff. The few surviving medical personnel worked without supplies, electricity, or adequate facilities, treating patients outdoors in the ruins. Water systems were destroyed, leaving no clean water for drinking or treating burns. Survivors with severe burns sought water desperately, drinking from contaminated sources and often dying from the combination of burns and dysentery. The rivers were clogged with corpses and contaminated with human waste and chemicals from destroyed industrial facilities, but thousands of survivors jumped into the water anyway, seeking relief from their burns, and many drowned. Food distribution systems collapsed. Survivors who were physically capable of moving had to search through ruins for food, often finding only contaminated supplies. Starvation became a significant cause of death in the weeks following the attack as the population struggled to obtain nutrition while dealing with injuries and radiation sickness. Firestorms developed across the city as thousands of individual fires merged. These fires burned for days, consuming everything combustible and creating temperatures that incinerated bodies of victims who had survived the initial blast. The firestorms generated winds that carried burning debris for miles, igniting new fires in areas that had escaped the initial destruction. Japanese authorities struggled to understand what had happened. Initial reports to Tokyo described Hiroshima as being destroyed by a single bomb of unknown type. Military analysts speculated that the Americans had developed a new type of incendiary weapon, but could not comprehend the scale of destruction from a single bomb. The true nature of the weapon would not be confirmed until after the Japanese surrender, when American occupation forces provided information on atomic weapons. Attempts at organized evacuation and relief were hindered by destroyed transportation infrastructure and communication systems. Railways into Hiroshima were damaged or destroyed. Roads were blocked by rubble and burning debris. Telephone and telegraph systems were non-functional. Relief workers who tried to enter the city from surrounding areas were turned back by fires and radiation, though they did not understand the radiation danger at the time. By August 8th, 2 days after the bombing, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki, killing approximately 75,000 people. The Japanese government finally understood that America possessed multiple atomic weapons and could continue destroying Japanese cities one by one. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese citizens had heard the emperor's voice. The war was over. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had accomplished what conventional bombing and blockade had not: forced Japanese surrender without invasion. The long-term effects. The atomic bombing's impact extended far beyond immediate casualties, creating medical consequences that persisted for decades. Radiation exposure caused delayed effects, killing thousands, months and years after. Acute radiation syndrome killed most victims within weeks as immune systems collapsed, but lower doses caused cancers appearing years later. Leukemia rates among survivors began rising within 2 years and remained elevated for decades. The Radiation Effects Research Foundation documented that cancer risk increased proportionally with radiation exposure. Survivors who received moderate doses had cancer rates approximately 1.5 times higher than unexposed populations. Psychological trauma affected virtually all survivors. Post-traumatic stress manifested in nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, and emotional numbing. Many survivors never spoke of their experiences. Others became anti-nuclear activists, dedicating their lives to ensuring atomic weapons would never be used again. Social stigma affected survivors in Japanese society. The term hibakusha identified atomic bomb survivors but carried connotations of contamination. Some faced discrimination in marriage and employment, adding psychological burden to physical suffering. Hiroshima recovered slowly. Reconstruction began within months but proceeded gradually. Within 5 years, a population had returned to pre-war levels. By 1960, the city had been completely reconstructed. The preserved atomic bomb dome became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1996. The Peace Memorial Park contains monuments dedicated to victims in nuclear disarmament. The strategic legacy. The atomic bombings transformed international relations and warfare in ways that remain relevant 8 decades later. The immediate consequence was forcing Japanese surrender without Operation Downfall. Whether this justified the bombings remains debated. Proponents argue they saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Critics argue Japan was already near surrender due to conventional bombing, blockade, and Soviet entry into the war on August 8th. What is undeniable is that atomic weapons immediately dominated international power relations. The Soviet Union tested atomic weapons in August 1949, Britain in 1952, France in 1960, China in 1964. By 2020, 9 nations possessed nuclear weapons with global stockpiles exceeding 13,000 warheads. The nuclear arms race dominated Cold War strategy for 4 decades. Both superpowers developed thermonuclear weapons with yields thousands of times greater than Hiroshima. The Soviet Union tested a 50-megaton weapon in 1961, the largest nuclear explosion in history. Mutually assured destruction emerged. Recognition that nuclear war between major powers would result in catastrophic casualties that no rational leader would initiate. This doctrine maintained uneasy peace through the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to the brink, but resolved without weapons being used. Arms control efforts attempted to limit proliferation. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 committed nuclear powers to work toward disarmament. Subsequent treaties reduced strategic arsenals from Cold War peaks exceeding 70,000 combined warheads to approximately 11,000 by 2020, but nuclear weapons remained central to military strategy. The hibakusha voice survivors of Hiroshima, the hibakusha, became witnesses to nuclear warfare, whose testimony provides moral weight to arguments for nuclear disarmament. Sunao Tsuboi, who was 20 years old and approximately 200 yards from the hypocenter when Little Boy detonated, survived with severe burns covering his body. He spent 14 months in hospital recovering from his injuries. For decades after, he spoke publicly about his experience, meeting with world leaders, including President Obama, who visited Hiroshima in 2016. Tsuboi's message was consistent. I do not want anyone, anywhere, to suffer what we suffered. Nuclear weapons must be eliminated, not reduced, not controlled, eliminated. The only guarantee against nuclear war is the complete abolition of nuclear weapons. Anything less leaves open the possibility that what happened to Hiroshima could happen again, perhaps to an entire world. Setsuko Thurlow, who was 13 years old and buried under her collapsed school building when the bomb exploded, became an anti-nuclear activist who addressed the United Nations and received the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons in 2017. Her Nobel lecture described her experience. I was pulled from the rubble by my classmates. We walked through a city transformed into hell. Everywhere we looked, people were dying. I saw a young mother with a dead baby on her back. She was singing a lullaby to the corpse, swaying gently, clearly in shock. I saw people with their eyeballs melting down their faces. I saw charred bodies so badly burned I could not tell if they had been men or women. For 75 years, I have carried these images. I speak now because most hibakusha have died. Soon there will be no living witnesses to the reality of nuclear war. You must remember what we saw. You must never allow it to happen again. Shinji Mikamo was 8 years old, far from the hypocenter, and survived with minor injuries. His older sister was never found, presumably vaporized at the hypocenter where she had been standing. Decades later, he spoke about the psychological impact. The worst part is not knowing. I never found my sister's body. There was nothing to bury, nothing to hold a funeral for. She simply ceased to exist. This uncertainty haunts our family still. Every August 6th I wonder exactly what her final moment was like. Did she feel pain? Was it instantaneous? Did she know what was happening? These questions have no answers. This is what nuclear weapons do. They don't just kill. They erase people from existence, leaving families with nothing but absence and unanswered questions. The words that cannot capture. Descriptions of Hiroshima ultimately fail because human language evolved to describe human-scale events. The atomic bombing exceeded scales that words can convey. 70,000 to 80,000 people died instantly. These words communicate a number, but cannot communicate what that means. Each person was an individual with memories, relationships, hopes, fears. Each death represented a complete universe of experience ending in a fraction of a second. These numbers are abstractions that protect us from reality. The reality is that each death was as significant as any in human history. Each created grief rippling through communities and generations. The atomic bomb did not just kill 140,000 people. It inflicted trauma on hundreds of thousands of survivors, family members, friends, descendants. Hiroshima forces confrontation with questions having no comfortable answers. Was the bombing justified? Did it save more lives than it took? These questions have been debated for 8 decades. What is certain is that Hiroshima demonstrated humanity had developed capacity to destroy itself. Hiroshima stands as both warning and proof that nuclear war is survivable at individual level, but catastrophic at civilization level. The city rebuilt. Survivors lived long lives. Life continued. But 140,000 people died, and the city existing before August 6, 1945 was permanently erased. The final accounting. The 509th Composite Group returned to Tinian on August 6th at 2:58 p.m. Crew members were debriefed and awarded medals. Celebrations were subdued. The crew understood the significance and weight of what they had done. In later years, crew members responded differently to questions about their mission. Theodore Van Kirk, the navigator, stated in 2005, "I have no regrets. I sleep clearly every night. Given the same circumstances, I would do it again. We were in a war we did not start. We were using the weapons we had to end that war as quickly as possible." Paul Tibbets maintained until his death in 2007 that he would not apologize. When asked if he had regrets, he responded, "None whatsoever. I knew when we got the assignment it was important. I knew we could do it. I knew it would probably end the war. Having done it, I have absolutely no regrets." Robert Lewis expressed more ambivalence. In his flight log, immediately after witnessing the explosion, he wrote, "My God, what have we done?" In later interviews, he acknowledged struggling. "I think about Hiroshima every day. I think about the people who died. I understand why we did it. I believe it was necessary, but that doesn't mean I don't wish there had been another way." Little Boy was remarkably inefficient. Of approximately 140 pounds of uranium-235, less than 2 pounds actually fissioned. Only 1.5% of the weapon's fissionable material contributed to the explosion. Yet this tiny fraction was sufficient to destroy a city. Modern nuclear weapons achieve fission rates approaching 20–30%, making them far more devastating. A weapon with little boy's mass but modern design could have yielded 10 times greater. Hiroshima thus represents not the maximum destructive capacity of nuclear weapons, but merely a demonstration that even crude, inefficient atomic weapons possess city-destroying power. The weapons in modern arsenals are not merely more numerous than the bombs used on Japan. They are individually thousands of times more destructive, capable of effects that make Hiroshima seem almost quaint by comparison. This is perhaps the most terrifying legacy of August 6, 1945, that the worst nuclear attack in history represents only a tiny fraction of what modern nuclear war would inflict. On August 6, 1945, at 8:16 a.m. and 2 seconds, a morning that had started peacefully ended with 70,000 to 80,000 people dead and a city destroyed. By December 1945, the death toll reached 140,000. In subsequent decades, thousands more died from cancers and other long-term effects. The total death toll from the Hiroshima bombing will never be precisely known, but likely exceeds 200,000 people when long-term effects are included. These deaths proved that nuclear weapons function as designed. They demonstrated that atomic bombs could be delivered by aircraft, that they would detonate reliably, and that their destructive power matched or exceeded predictions. They showed that a single weapon could accomplish what previously required hundreds of bombers and thousands of tons of conventional explosives, and they established that no defense existed against nuclear attack. Hiroshima began as a normal Monday morning. Children walked to school. Adults commuted to work. People planned their days, made appointments, thought about the future. At 8:16 a.m., all of that ended for 70,000 to 80,000 people in one instant. Their final moments were spent in ordinary activities, unaware that their lives would end in seconds. The weapon that killed them had been built by people they never met, delivered by an aircraft crew who never saw their faces, and detonated without warning or opportunity for defense. This is the nature of nuclear warfare. It is industrial-scale killing conducted at a distance by people who never confront the human consequences of their actions. The crew of Enola never saw the people they killed. They saw only the flash of the explosion and the mushroom cloud rising above the city. The scientists who designed the bomb never visited Hiroshima. The politicians who authorized its use never walked through the ruins or treated the injured. Nuclear war creates complete separation between those who make decisions, those who carry them out, and those who suffer the consequences. Hiroshima thus stands as the ultimate expression of modern warfare's depersonalization, the intimacy of combat where soldiers faced each other at close range, saw the humanity in their enemies' eyes, and directly experienced the consequences of violence was replaced by bombing from altitudes where targets were anonymous dots on the landscape, and ultimately by nuclear weapons where entire populations could be annihilated by people who would never see or hear them die. The voices of Hibakusha, the survivors, provide the only counter to this depersonalization. Their testimony forces confrontation with the reality that every number, every casualty statistic, every reference to collateral damage represents individual human beings whose deaths were as significant as any death in history. When Setsuko Thurlow describes watching a mother sing lullabies to her dead baby, she forces recognition that nuclear war does not just destroy cities and infrastructure. It kills people, real people with names and faces and families, people who deserve to be remembered as individuals rather than buried in statistics. Hiroshima morning started peacefully, with clear skies and comfortable temperatures, with people going about their ordinary lives expecting an ordinary Monday. By 8:16 a.m., it had become the first victim of nuclear warfare, a distinction that carries weight because what happened there could happen anywhere, to any city at any time, as long as nuclear weapons exist. The bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was not a freak occurrence or experimental failure. It worked exactly as designed. That is both its horror and its warning. Nuclear weapons do what they are built to do. They destroy cities and kill tens of thousands of people in seconds. Hiroshima proved it. The question facing humanity since August 6, 1945 is whether we will allow it to happen again, and if not, what we are willing to do to prevent it.